My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. My soul magnifies the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God. My soul magnifies the Lord.
Turn this mic on. All right. It's an exciting day in the neighborhood. It is good to see all of you this morning. I can't think of any place I'd rather be this morning than here. And Nolan and Connie are here. And I mean, we got Bobby and Shirley are here. We got people from all over the world in here this morning. So, well, hey, Mark. How are you? Aren't we all? So this is a great day. It's always a great day. So we're studying Esther. Actually, hopefully, we're going to finish the book of Esther today. And then we'll finish up Ezra in the next 2 weeks, and then we'll be done. And I'm sorry about Nehemiah. I just wasn't any way to get it all in. So I apologize. I'm still willing to do a Zoom class if anybody wants a class on Nehemiah, because it's probably not long enough to take a whole quarter to do. And I'm not sure how. If I did Nehemiah separately, I would probably do Haggai and Zechariah at the same time, because they're all contemporaries. That's what I might do. Who knows? Who knows? Anyway, good morning. I think we can get started. Okay. Everybody's seen this timeline. We're in the last section of that timeline. We're doing chapters 9 and 10, or 10 and 11, or 14 and 15. It's actually 9, but we'll get it all done. Everything's fine. I think I got the wrong. Yeah, see, it says 10, but I know it's 9, so don't worry about it. We'll be good. All right. Last week, a lot of things happened, and Haman got terminated, and so he's no longer around, but the problem was still around, and they had to work through those difficulties. And so basically, we're at the 13th day of the month of Adar, and the Jews, they have basically gathered in the larger cities where they had people that were not happy with them, and they prepared, and they were, their enemies also prepared, I'm sure, and they had to be aware of each other's preparation, because it'd been advertised throughout the kingdom that they could kill the Jews on that day, and the Jews could defend themselves on that day. So all of those things were coming to a head now. People who hated the Jews, and I guess there were a few, they basically thought, well, we're just going to slaughter and pillage and plunder all these Jews, take all their property, and they'll be all gone and be no more. So the Jews gathered in their cities, and that doesn't mean that they had cities set aside for the Jews, but there were cities that they were kind of exclusively inhabited by Jews, but there were also, other people from the empire that were still there, but the Jews were an element of the population, and probably larger in some cities. It wasn't the intention of the Jews to provoke hostility by going where they didn't belong or something like that. They weren't aggressors. They simply knew that for the purposes of defense, there would be strength in numbers. So they basically would gather together in these cities, and so they would be in a better position to defend themselves. This text is a hard text to read because so many things are happening, but they were very well organized. So well organized that it was said that nobody could withstand them. That's an interesting thought. They were very capable of defending themselves. They pretty much were all involved. And so the difference is here the Jews are facing extermination. That's the difference. That's what they're fighting for. They're fighting to hang around, not to be extinct. And that's the Babylonians, the Persians, the Medes, they weren't fighting for the same thing. They were fighting to get rid of the Jews. The Jews were fighting for their lives. in the lives of their people. So they were really very highly motivated. There were no issues of territorial infringements. There were no rebellions. There were no national sovereignty issues, like the picture Haman had painted for Xerxes. The war against him was irrational. It was unjust. It was genocidal. All of those things. And they hadn't done anything to deserve to be murdered. And they had right on their side. So they did not have any reason not to fight with great vigor. Mordecai, and this is important to understand, Mordecai had put himself or allowed himself to be put in a position of great power within the province or within the nation or country of Persia. He was second in command to Ahasuerus or Xerxes, same person. And so they had Mordecai, who was extremely powerful, and they had the queen, who was also powerful in her own right. And so the queen and the prime minister of the entire empire, were a powerful force in and of themselves. And a lot of the administrative and ruling entities, the satraps, and those people who worked throughout the different provinces, I think there were like 127 provinces in Persia, they helped the Jews. Why? Because Mordecai was a force to be reckoned with, my opinion. But they had respect, or they feared Mordecai. And Mordecai's authority was equal or greater than what Haman had possessed. He was second to the king. So that's a big deal. As we read through, as we close up the book of Esther, you'll see how Mordecai, his position was greatly amplified in the eyes of the Jews and in the eyes of the Persians. So all of those things played together into their favor. If you look at verse 4 of chapter 9, what you see is this idea about how Mordecai was a significant player. If you read it in the Septuagint, it says, "For the decree of the king was being enforced that he, Mordecai, should be reputed in all the kingdom." Basically, what they're saying is that, the king's edict, which was written by Mordecai and the queen, Esther, was considered to be superseding the previous edict. They just couldn't reverse it. You think about it, it does make sense. But the Hebrew word that's used in this particular passage is ratzah, and what that really means is it says what's good or acceptable. In other words, they're acting in the welfare of the Jews. So Mordecai was acting in their welfare, and the Jews were also acting in their welfare. They were taking an active part in participating in this entire process. So I think it's notable to see that. But as we get through this fight, if you will, we're going to see that the Jews defeated their enemies, but there's something they didn't do, and they could have, and they did not take the enemy's plunder. In other words, they could have taken the wealth and everything else of the people that they destroyed, if you will, or killed. They didn't do that. I thought that was interesting. They had the permission to do it, but they did not do it. So we get the name of Haman's 10 sons, which was a lot of sons. And to have a significant amount of sons that was a big deal. In other words, if you had a lot of sons, you were even considered more powerful because you had this large family. And if they were sons, it was even better. And so if you look at this in the Masoretic text, what you see is that they put the 10 sons in order on the right side of the column, and then on the left side, they have a little brief description. And so the origin of this tradition probably was over time where the sons of men were basically uniquely identified. Now, all 10 of those sons, they had the distinction of all being hung, mounted on the pole, because that was the Persians' action. And so when they have the festival of Purim, which we mentioned briefly last week, they always read all the names of Haman's sons. And they try to read them all in one breath. I cannot do it. I'm not even going to try. But the Talmud states they all die together, and so when they read their names, they read them just like one long name, and they just pile them all up. Now, all the names have a Persian origin of those sons, except for one. The son Adelia was not a Persian name. There's Parshandatha, which means given to Persia. There's Dalphon, which means arrogant. There's Aspatha, which means horse. There's Poratha, which means having many chariots. Aridatha means liberal. Parmashta means greatest. Arisai means to conquer. Aridai means to give. And Vathazda means strong as the wind. So these names mean something, and they're granted throughout Persian history. When you name your sons, you want to take this name of power. So those are the 10 sons of Haman. There will be a test in a couple minutes. I'll have you repeat back all those names. No, I won't. But most of the book of Esther, as its source, uses the Royal Chronicles of Persia. So the Chronicles of Persia have a lot of this data recorded in there. And those are historical records. The author of Esther, whoever it might be, was probably pretty impressed with these 10 sons when he read those names and said, okay, this is the equivalency of those names. But it does kind of fit with the Esther is a very precise book, and so it does fit the character of Esther to record that detail. If you read Esther, you understand that detail is important. And in verse 10, we're basically told that the Jews didn't lay their hands on the property of those they killed. The edict that was given by Haman back in chapter 3, verse 13, was that the Jewish victims should have their property plundered. When Xerxes allowed Mordecai to give official permission to the Jews to resist the massacre, in other words, to fight back, well, what happened is that they were also allowed to take the plunder of those that they conquered, but they did not do that. So just an interesting observation. The fact that the Jews didn't seize the property is mentioned a number of times in latter chapters of Esther. They just didn't take it. They were not motivated by greed. The Jews didn't, conquering these people had nothing to do with greed. It had everything to do with defending themselves, saving their lives. So taking the property really wasn't something they had ever even considered. The king, he got a regular report of the number of Persians that were slain. It was customary at that time to keep a body count, and so in the Babylonian transcript of the Behistun inscription, the numbers of the people that are slain in battle are given with exact numbers. In other words, how many exactly in this province, how many in that. So in the secular historical records, there is a record of how many and exactly were slain, even when Xerxes had gone over to try to conquer the Greeks. They kept numbers of how many Persians were lost and how many Greeks were lost. Numbers were important. The Jews, they knew that they were not left to kill indiscriminately. In other words, they couldn't just kill somebody passing by on the road. It had to be somebody who was actively attacking them, if I understand everything correctly. And so they had, a mission and a purpose. It talks about the number of deaths in the palace area on the first day, which was what 500 were killed. And if you look at some archaeological information regarding Susa, it had a kind of an acropolis, a hill area, and the palace is always on the higher ground. And so the 500 people that were executed or killed on the first day were people that were up on that acropolis, that the area of the palace and the grounds that kind of surrounded it. So those people were the ones that were executed in Susa. We don't have the numbers in some of the other cities. We just know what the totals were. When the king heard the number that were slain in his area, he probably told Esther, "Hey, 500 have been killed so far." He probably knew that this initial Jewish resistance was going to be significant. I don't know. It's hard to understand some of this. I don't know if the significance of the Persians that were executed, how they fit into the governmental system and into the leadership roles. We know, for example, that the leaders and the rulers of the local provinces, they helped the Jews for the most part. And so I don't know how significant a loss was. Were these just men who wanted to create problems for the Jews, didn't like the Jews, just wanted them gone? Were they friends of Haman? Well, maybe in the Susa area they may have been. But he tells Esther, here's how many have been killed. And he also wants her to understand that he has her best interest at heart. In other words, he's supporting this and he's just giving her the numbers, but it's only because he's trying to make points with Esther. That's what I think. Well, there is some truth. Well, okay, so when you look at it, when you look at the death of the enemies of the Jews, this is not new. Okay, when the nation of Israel marched into Canaan, how many people were executed? A bunch. Well, they all had a matter. There's no death that's not insignificant, but from the political or geopolitical, if you take a look at it, not that you're discounting any deaths. I'm certainly not trying to do that. I'm just taking the numbers that were given in Esther. No death is insignificant. It's like I tell people, it's always minor surgery unless it's me. And that makes a difference. So when you think about it, yes, it was significant, but in the geopolitical sense of the ruling class of Persia at that time, it was just, it was a thing. It was a thing. The interesting thing is that outside of the city, well, here, let's do this. So outside of Susa, all right, 75,000 were executed or killed, but they didn't take any of the spoils of that. Susa was the chief capital at the time because that's where Xerxes was from. Even though there were 3 capital cities, Susa was at that time the primary capital city. And although 500 were killed in that city, it was not enough. They had to go back the next day, and they killed 300 more down in the city proper, not up on the Acropolis. So this whole process of getting things in order to protect the Jews was a process. It wasn't just, it happened. But again, they're fighting for their very lives from the standpoint of extermination, genocide, wiping out an entire race. Because all the Jews at that time lived in the Persian Empire. Even the Jews in Judah, they lived in the Persian. Judah was part of the Persian Empire. Sometimes we kind of scoop by there, but understand that all of that was the property of Persia. Well, Judah was the province or the tribal home of the Jews after the kingdoms were split, and so. Well, there are 3 capital cities. One of them is Susa, one of them is Babylon, and the other one I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Babylon, yeah. Oh, Susa.
I mean, it sounds like 75,000 killed is a lot.
But in the scheme of how many Jews there were versus how many Persians there were, it's not.
But I'm sure that the 75,000 killed were adversaries, not just.
Yeah, well, because the Jews could not they only had an edict that allowed them to defend themselves. Yeah, the Jews could only defend themselves. They could not arbitrarily attack anybody else. They had to first be challenged or attacked in order for them to defend themselves. So yes, and I don't know what the real numbers are, but I have read a few things that suggest that in Babylon at that time, in the entire nation or Babylon, which you remember went from the reaches of Africa to northern Russia, there might have been 3 million Jews in that land area and considerably more Persians. Now, they would have been made up of different people, Indians, those kind of the people that lived in those areas. So, but everybody there was a Persian, even though they were a Jew or they were this or they were that. In other words, so they're just considered to be part of the Persian Empire. The unique thing about the Persian Empire was that they did not force societies to completely blend into their social fabric. They let them maintain their lifestyle for the most part. And Jews were very important to Persia because they held high positions. They were working in the leadership roles in Persia. They were running the banks. They were doing, they're just all kinds of things. Daniel is a good example of somebody who prospered in the Persian way of life. While he was a Jew, he was also a Persian, and he knew how to work in the framework.
Before you start all this, you said something about the Greeks, and then you drifted into the Jews.
Well, okay, I said something about the Greeks only because when Xerxes first came into power, he basically mounted this attack on the Greeks. It's where remember I talked about he assembled the rowboats all together and he marched across the boat bridge, and he lost several men in that event. And he came back home and he hadn't won the battle, but that's another story. So the interesting thing about this, from my standpoint, and that's just me, is the way in which they handle Haman's sons. I don't know why Haman's sons are singled out in this story particularly. In other words, they're all hung on the pole just like Dad. I don't know if it has anything to do with it or not, but I know that Mordecai probably would not have gone after the remainder of the people in Susa without at least telling the king, hey, we're not quite done, we got a few more that are causing problems, and we couldn't get them all today. But I don't know why they were singled out other than they were Haman's sons. And Esther particularly asked to have Haman's sons hung, like Haman was. Probably as a display to show, you act against the king and against the king's wishes, and there'll be a price to be paid. And that would have been a pretty strong deterrent to any non-Jews who would have seen that display of Haman's sons hung in public. There's this whole thing about capital punishment being both biblical and practical.
Capital punishment, there was no other kinds of punishment?
I don't know. I don't know if it was just capital punishment. Most of the time, if you acted outside the accordance of the king, the usual solution was simple. They didn't want to pay for you to be in prison for 40 years. They just execute, but that's not just Persia. If you go back through history, you'll find there are many other, Tommy, was it the Romans that actually formalized jails? I can't remember. But incarceration was not a popular thing, because if you incarcerated people, you had to feed them and take care of them and heal them and everything else. So execution was the most prominent form of punishment. And we don't like it, but it's a fact. What's that? They do. If you release, they did have a way of coming back. I think it's still true today, actually. So, but there is a interesting study I've read about capital punishment out throughout history, which is very telling in a way. And so ancient cities, they were, remember I said they're built up on an acropolis if they can. They're usually walled. And that's where the government complex is kind of located. But people lived in houses outside the city walls, and whenever something was about to happen, they would all leave their houses and come into the city, the walled city. The same thing happened in Jerusalem. If somebody attacked the area around Judah, they would go back to the city because they had the walls to help defend them. So that's just an interesting thought. So you live around the city, but if something that bad happens, you come into the city to be protected. And basically, you'd have some warning that this was going to happen. So we had, the people outside the walls and outside the Acropolis and the houses out around. Some of them must have continued to attack the Jews, and there were 300 additional in Susa on the second day, which caused another problem. Because the Jews in Susa, they couldn't rest on the 14th day of Adar because they were still fighting. Where out in the provincial parts of the country, the Jews out there, they got business done in day one on the 13th of Adar, and they celebrated on the 14th. And but so out in those provinces, all of that area we talked about, and with the help of the Persian officials, they basically killed 75,000 people. Now, if you read the Septuagint,
I got something that's going to bug you.
everything bugs me.
Chiefs about to win for the third time.
What's that?
Super Bowl today. But I'm sorry for interrupting you.
Anyway, the Septuagint, the number they recorded was 15,000, but that doesn't make numerical sense when compared to the historical documentation from that time. The 75,000 is probably more accurate. If you consider how large the Persian Empire was, and they killed 800 in Susa alone, well, if you multiply that by the number of large cities, which were probably 90-some cities, you'd have just over 75,000. So that's probably the most accurate number. You take all of that into effect, and you figure out, the Septuagint in this particular was not correct. I like the Septuagint for history, but sometimes they have a tendency to get it wrong, and you have to do some more research to get it right. But again, when we read in here, we find out they did not plunder the cities, the people that they conquered. They didn't do that. So they were able to rest, the people in the provinces, they were able to rest.
So the plunder wasn't greed, basically, they did not do these things.
They did not, they weren't greedy, they weren't there to take the property of the people they killed.
That's the way of the Lord, isn't it?
There's no plunder, Yeah, no plunder in this particular event. Unlike in Canaan, they were told, take the property and things of the people that you conquer, except in some cases. In some cases, they were told, okay, this is to be reserved for this particular thing. We don't always get that right either. But so anyway, so in the city of Susa, because they took 2 days, they couldn't rest on the 14th. They would have to rest on the 15th because it was 2 days. So when Esther and Mordecai were trying to set up some kind of a national celebration for this event, and when they basically saved their race, if you will, they decided to keep both days. In other words, so they would celebrate on the 14th and 15th instead of just, having one time. And this was what had to do with the Feast of Purim, which is what that celebration was basically called at that time. And Purim is a minor festival. And you can work on Purim where you can't work on in some other, in Passover, for example. You can't work during Passover or things like that. Purim is a festival, but it's not a high festival that they can't work on. What's unique about Purim, and Purim is still celebrated today by the Jews, they chant. It's different from a lot of the other Jewish festivals, and what they chant is based upon the scroll of Esther, and so all the different blessings and things that that you find in Esther, they make part of their chant. There's 4 verses. It's chapter 2, verse 5, chapter 8, verses 15 and 16, and chapter 10, verse 3. That while they read the entire book of Esther in Purim, they read those 4 verses extra loud. So they are given attention or called to attention, but they read those in a louder voice. And then when they read those verses, and they mention the name of Haman, the children all boo and hiss when they mention Haman's name. And when they mention the name of Esther or Mordecai, then everybody cheers. And this is a big formal deal. And so they pay attention to this. And then sometimes they will burn an effigy of Haman at Purim, and they will also send 2 portions of food to a friend. There's some generosity involved here. Now, the food is usually a dessert, a sweet of some kind. And then they eat a special meal. The meal is eaten on Purim. It's boiled beans and peas, which is similar to Daniel's pulse diet in Daniel 1, chapter 1, verse 12. And these 3-cornered pies called Haman Tassin, which stands for Haman's ears. I know, okay. Yummy! Yummy! It's also a festival where some alcohol is consumed. I don't know why, but maybe the Persian influences got into it. The saner rabbis now, they kind of explain that away and say it's really not encouraged, but it's not denied either. So it's just it. But among the masses of Jews today, anything on Purim, anything's allowed. It's kind of like, what do they call that thing they do in New Orleans every once in a while? Mardi Gras, thank you. It's kind of like Mardi Gras for the Jews. So they have plays, and they have carnivals, and they have parades. People dress up in costume, masquerade. They do some things that are also kind of different as well, but just sharing. All right, where am I going here? Okay, so the Purim is a big deal, but not for all Jews. Some of them, because it's a minor festival, they can work, and some of them just soon go to work, and they don't take a day off for it. The lots that remember that P-U-R, we said were lots. That's kind of like the lots that were cast on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16:8. This is kind of what men call fate or luck. Serves as kind of a manifestation of God's providential care. It does appear, if you look at 9:26, that the reason the festival is named Purim, lots, is because Haman's lots turned out to be his undoing. In other words, Haman casting lots and determining the days that they were going to eradicate the Jews are all a part of that process. It was accepted and perpetuated among even the more conservative Jews for a time, but over time it's not, even currently today, it's not as big a deal as it was years ago. So they say that Joachim, who was the high priest at the time, if we'd gotten to Nehemiah, we would have talked about this, must have given his approval for the feast and adopted into the ritual of the nation, otherwise it wouldn't have become so universally accepted or perpetuated. Take that, for whatever. Mordecai, he must have taken special care to impress on all the Jews that the whole country at that day, that there was a reason for the holiday. And it was for the Jews to remember that they defended themselves against being eradicated. That was really the whole reason for it. But like I say, it's still observed by most Jews today. There's a big carnival in Tel Aviv called Adaloyada. I know that's, and what it means, it's Adi Diloyada, and what it means is until one no longer knows the difference between blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman, which means that carnival will go on forever and ever and ever, simply because that's never going to happen. They're never going to forget about Mordecai or forget about Haman. So that's just another piece. Mordecai's first letter seemed like it was more of a suggestion about commemorating the deliverance, their deliverance on that day. But eventually what happened is that a more formal document was created, and it was blended into the Chronicles. So this is also recorded in the Chronicles of Persia as an event. And so that was baked in to the entire royal documentation. Included in that document, those chronicles, are the official letters from the Queen and the Prime Minister, declarations of peace, pledges of truth. Basically, I wanted to say that the Jews are always going to be, in reverence and in awe of God, and they're always going to look after themselves. And so, kind of hasn't changed very much, to be honest about it. So basically, it was just, a thing they did. Mordecai basically, said, this is acceptable. We can do this. All right. So, some commentators, they think the part of the last closing part of chapter 10 may have been added after Esther was written or committed to writing. They think probably it was to make sure that the Jews understand that Mordecai was not just somebody, living down on the streets. He was the second in command to Xerxes. And, the natural conclusion of the book probably would have been the feast of Purim, but I think what happened is that the writer of the book wanted to recognize Mordecai in a special way and acknowledge, how important he was to this story. I mean, I think I mentioned this probably could have been called the Book of Mordecai, and it would still have made sense. So that's basically everything rolled into the whole story. Actually, if you get into the Chronicles, you'll find how that Xerxes was a benevolent leader, benevolent emperor, king, that his recognition of Mordecai's capability and skills, because it was obvious as he watched Mordecai around him. But even the greatest of men are soon forgotten. Outside of the record of Esther, we don't have a lot of information about Xerxes. There's a little bit in history, but not a lot. It was not uncommon or unusual for a Jew to be in a high position in a Gentile government. If we look through the New Testament, we're going to see people that, and history. Josephus has a lot of this. Jewish people were in positions of power. They were put in positions of power usually for a reason. Look at Joseph. Look at Daniel. These are men that have made a difference over time in their lives. Mordecai won for himself the name of a great and good statesman. He was, he was accountable, and he was, did his job correctly. The real measure of Mordecai's greatness or Joseph, it's not power. It's the beneficial use of power. We say that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Beneficial power shares its fruit with everybody. Not just in power, but beneficial power. And I think that's important to note from Mordecai. It's the measure of all of us. All of us in our own right possess skills and abilities. What do we do with it? How do we handle it? In his high position, Mordecai did not forget about his kinsmen. He always labored for their good and for peace, and Xerxes likewise. He influenced Xerxes to do the very same thing, to keep all of this nation of Persia at peace. Once this was done, Xerxes did an excellent job of that. He didn't go back to war. Not to say that his descendants didn't, but he didn't. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for allowing us to gather here this morning, and we ask, Father, that you'll bless each of us here. Give us the ability to share our gifts with others in a beneficial way. Help us to set an example for others around us each and every day of our lives. Help us, Lord, to do the right thing each day. Lord, we have a lot of our brothers and sisters who are suffering from a variety of physical maladies. We ask that you might bless and comfort them. We ask that you might give them peace. We ask, Father, that you might watch over us always. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.